But more important, Dr. Baldwin, let's see if we can reflect upon some of the things that have happened over the last few days,
yes,
dealing with some of the things that Dr. King was involved in. Let's talk about it from that perspective.
What we've seen over the last few days, as you well know, with the Supreme Court decisions, we've seen an attack pretty much on affirmative action. Well, not so much an attack on affirmative action, but an attack on voting rights. The decision on affirmative action, I think, did not destroy the affirmative action policies, which Dr. King was very much in favor of. Many conservatives, I mentioned before the last segment, at the end of the last segment, that Dr. King always felt that affirmative action should be in place, not simply for black people, but for all poor people. And he felt that affirmative action should be need-based and not so much race-based. And that's important. That has been pretty much kept in place, despite the fact that you have many attacks on affirmative action from the religious right and from the political right. But when it comes to voting rights, of course, we've seen over the last few days an effort to erode this whole idea of federal oversight. When you look at states like Alabama, my home state, Mississippi, Arkansas, those southern states, which, of course, as you well know, in the past, have had many problems with voting. We wonder what will happen now, because what happened with the Supreme Court decision is that you had pretty much the elimination of federal oversight of voting processes in these states. So what will happen? Will the votes be counted? Will blacks be intimidated at the polls? We have these kinds of questions now, and it all, I think, amounts to a kind of backing away from Dr. King's legacy, because, as you well know, Dr. King was all about voting rights, not only voting rights, but the right of people to hold public office. And we know that in 1965, the march from Selma to Montgomery was all about achieving not only voting rights, but the right of political participation. And we've seen over the last few years efforts to intimidate voters, voter suppression. We saw that in the last presidential election, and we wonder what will happen now that federal oversight of the voting processes in this country have been sort of eroded with the recent Supreme Court decision.
And so in a real sense, I think the challenge is really to almost rewrite, in a real sense, the whole history of voting in this country, because you just can't sit back and not do anything.
Exactly.
And I think the pattern has already been laid out as to how you accomplish voting rights in this country. Do you think that it now requires us to do the same thing as getting back into the streets, the same kind of activity?
I hope not, but it may require a kind of reoccurrence of what was happening in the 1960s. And of course, leaders like Al Sharpton have already said that perhaps we will have to take to the streets again to make sure that voting rights are secured. But I hope it doesn't, but it may very well require some of the same kind of activism that occurred in the 1960s.
Very good. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is part of Dr. King's legacy.
It's part of his legacy,
so,
yeah.
And that is only the political side. And what are some of the other things that will draw us out and perhaps convince folks that there is a real need for some kind of action during this time, whether it's just writing letters or whether it's marching?
Yes, I think writing letters to congressmen is very, very important, and Al Sharpton has recommended that. I think we also have to look at the possibilities of nonviolent direct action in the form of marches and demonstrations. I think that's still relevant to our times. But the important thing is to make sure that people's right to vote is secured, and all Americans' right to vote is secured, and we have to do whatever necessary to make sure that that happens.
And so in a real sense, Dr. King's assassination left a legacy of struggle in a real sense,
and a legacy of activism.
Activism.
Yes.
And so, in order for us to live up to what Dr. King was all about, then we have to at least do something. We just cannot decide. And what about just actual participation in the suffrage, which is to say that there are so many folks
who don't vote. Exactly.
And who are not registered to vote, and who and some, I know in some of our own households, there are individuals within our own households who don't understand the importance of vote. What do we do in reference to that in terms of our own personal kind of commitment to increasing the number of individuals, black or white, who are registered to vote?
Well, I think Dr. King said something back in 1965, and I think it's still relevant, is that education is very important, that we got to use the tools of education to get people to see the importance of voting, that in any process of participatory democracy, people have to vote. You can't sit at home and not vote and then complain about the way government is run, you see? And I think education is the important thing. I think we also have to knock on doors, talk to people, meet people in churches, and of course the black church has always been used as that kind of institution that informs people about what's going on in society and the need to engage in not only political advocacy but political participation. So we need to use the institutions in our community, the church, the family, the schools, to educate people, to get them to see the importance of participating in democracy, that if they want representative democracy, if they want participatory democracy, then they have to become a part of it.
And to sort of make a personal kind of commitment, recognizing that no matter what state you might live in, no matter what kind of conditions that they might throw up in terms of trying to disenfranchise you, that make sure that you can live up to whatever it is. If it means going out in the weather and standing out in the weather and waiting at the polls a long time in terms of casting a ballot, then even if it's not easy to do so, we ought to make up our minds that we are going to do it, and that we have no alternative save to do it. I mean, that has been my attitude in reference to it, that whatever the state of Tennessee might throw up in terms of trying to keep me from voting, I am going to make, if anybody make it in terms of participating in the suffrage, I am going to participate. And I think that if we get that attitude, and if we get a lot of people with that kind of attitude, no matter what they do, then, then we will be able to vote, because there's nothing more important
than voting, because if you have no vote, you have no voice.
No voice.
And that's not good for democracy.
That's not good at all.
We fought and marched, and many died for the creation of true participatory democracy. And if you don't vote, then you're not a part of that democracy.
And we had it going well up until quite recently, up until the recent Supreme Court decision, because now people are going back to the drawing boards and trying to reorganize the counties and et cetera and et cetera.
And that should embolden us and should inspire us and motivate us to become a part of the political processes. I think given what is happening now and what has happened over the last year or so with voter suppression and voter intimidation, that should inspire us to become a part of the process, to really register to vote. That should inspire us.
Yeah, and so hopefully what you've said here today in reference to the assassination of Dr. King and the legacy of Dr. King, and I think that if people can sort of buy into the things that we're talking about now, we'll be all right in reference to, and Africans still have to recognize that they're not fighting this war, this battle by themselves. We didn't fight the Civil Rights War by themselves. There are a large number of sympathetic folks who are interested in the participation of everybody in the suffrage. And let me thank you, Dr. Baldwin, for bringing by that excellent information. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.